So the Indian Residential School Society, Survivor Society, is an organization that I just started to learn about and hear about in this past year, and it's so unfortunate that it comes to issues, and only at these times do we start to realize. But we're able to have, in lieu of registrations, thank you so much to our sponsors. So if you remember today, you didn't have to make any type of contribution for registration. That was provided through our sponsors to put this all together. So we are asking that you look through the links today that we'll continue to put up to potentially make a donation. So here is the site. It will be in the chats as we go, and I'm really excited to be able to introduce Wesley Scott, who's here, who's going to speak on the incredible work that has been done through the IRS. Wesley Scott is a workshop coordinator, counselor, and support worker with the Indian Residential School Survivor Society. He has worked with the organization since 2013, providing emotional support, trauma counseling, and educational presentations to residential school survivors, intergenerational survivors, and the greater community in BC. His professional experience pertains to the areas of mental health and addictions, street community outreach, and IAP hearing survivor support. He is a first-generation Canadian living on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in the city of Vancouver. And my apologies there, Wesley. I'm hoping you will, explain that in further detail. But welcome today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. There is no need to apologize. I completely understand. So again, Wesley Scott. I work with the Indian Residential School Survivor Society, and what that mouthful means is that I provide workshop presentations on the history and impacts of residential schools. I also provide discussions on cultural agility and competency, but more than that, I also provide emotional support and crisis counseling for survivors. I work very closely with survivors. In fact, when I started with the society over 8 years ago, my position was to provide support at government hearings as survivors shared their testimony. I am on the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Nation territory in Vancouver, specifically Kitsilano, and I grew up in the Wasanich area. I am very grateful to hear these land acknowledgements, and I want to say Haichka and thank you to Bruce for that opening, and I want to thank Christy and Philip for welcoming me here today. I am a first-generation Canadian, and I work with an Indigenous organization. I'm the only first-generation Canadian in a support capacity with our organization. I work alongside survivors and intergenerational survivors. Our organization has over a 20-year experience. We started as a result of the First Nations Summit in BC in 1994. The society shifted from the residential school project to the Indian Residential School Survivor Society in 2002. So our organization has a steady history of providing support to survivors and intergenerational survivors in First Nations communities throughout British Columbia for a significant amount of time. A lot of this was to assist survivors during the process of litigation and compensation as the stories were told with the common experience payment, for instance, and the IAP process, the independent assessment process. Now we have the conclusion of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the development of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And now we have the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which is based on Orange Shirt Day in some ways. And this has been a lot to take in this year with the announcements of the identification of bodies throughout various residential school sites. Sometimes I get asked why I do this work, and I think the simple reason is, I think that everyone who's hurting deserves a voice and deserves emotional support. I think that schools shouldn't have graveyards, and I think that this is a part of Canadian history we need to remember. Bruce kindly started his address by speaking in his language. And I'm reminded of the fact that there are over 50 distinct languages in Canada, over 600 unique nations. This mosaic of culture and identity is so important. And the history of Canada's treatment towards Indigenous people, specifically First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, has been uniform. It has been with the singular goal of assimilation. It has not taken this diversity into account. And you know, this history hits home. 150,000 children went through the Indian residential school system in Canada. And for me, that hits home because in Victoria, you know, the population at the time I was living there was just over 300,000. So that's like half of the city having gone to residential school. More importantly, of course, they were taking kids as young as 4, 5, and 6 to residential school, away from their home communities, denying them of their language, denying them of their culture, denying them of their families, their primary sources of education, in these conditions of malnourishment and abuse. Significant trauma occurred at these schools, of physical, emotional, and even sexual. This was a significant system of oppression. And my kid's sister in 1996, so the last school closed in 1996. My kid's sister would have been 6 years old at the time. And so that's only 25 years ago. So this still hits home to me. And I think that this is something that hits home for a large number of people, is that this is still a very current and lived history. And I've met survivors in their 60s and 70s, but I've also met younger survivors as well. And the impact is just as real for them, regardless of the age. Everyone's experience at residential school, I'm sure, is unique to them. I'm not saying that it was uniform, and you will find that some people will say, for instance, oh, I didn't have it as bad as somebody. But there is documented evidence of these conditions, of these abuse, and no child should have had to go through that system. You know, one thing our executive director talks about, our executive director, her name is Angela White, and she likes to share her story as an intergenerational survivor. But one thing she often remembers is her grandmother saying to her, "You're not Indian, you're not First Nations, you're not Indigenous, you are not Aboriginal, you are Sineimuk," from the Nanaimo region. And it really hits home in that sense that, you know, this is a unique nation. And so, you know, we want to be cautious of the language we use, of course. And so, you know, I work for the Indian Residential School Survivors Society, and some people have problems with that name. Some people have problems with the name because, you know, the word Indian is not appropriate necessarily in all contexts nowadays. But the reason why our organization uses that name is because it has a historical and a legal context to it. But make no mistake, you know, this legacy extends beyond language. These were institutions designed for oppression and assimilation. They were designed, as many quotes in even government documents, to kill the Indian in the child. You know, this relevant term applies because we still have in Canada the Indian Act today. So we have all these 600 nations, as I was mentioning, under a single piece of legislation. And Indigenous people, be it First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, are all under this singular piece of legislation. So children were taken from their homes, often forcibly by clergy members, RCMP, or Indian agents who oversaw reserves. Sometimes they would be sent to institutions in their communities, but sometimes they would be sent provinces away. Not to mention, of course, that they were facing strict punishment if they practiced their language or spoke in their traditional tongues, or practiced anything to do with their culture. You know, they weren't considered. They weren't concerned with providing proper education like we might consider with, the basics of education, math, etc. They were more concerned with industrial skills, religious education, cleaning, farming, things like that. It's also to be noted that these institutions were rampant with diseases such as tuberculosis, often for the purposes of experimentation to note the spread of such diseases. Um, these conditions are a matter of record. You have people like Dr. Peter Bryce who have written on this and have written extensively on the mortality rate at these institutions, varying from in Western Canada, varying from 30 to 60% at certain points in history. These weren't typical boarding schools. They were institutions of cultural genocide and neglect and abuse. And these conditions where a lack of self-worth was given, where a lack of respect for traditional ways was instilled, these conditions would have impacts for generations to come. And so we talk about intergenerational survivors, the children of survivors. So if someone experiences trauma and that trauma is not dealt with, that trauma, then the impacts of that trauma can be passed down on to subsequent generations, children, grandchildren of survivors. And so we see things in, obviously this is not to say that the impacts are the same for everyone who attended residential school, but that these impacts exist, be it a disconnection from the natural worlds, disconnection from spirituality, alienation from one's own language, lack of self-worth, dysfunction in the family, an increased prevalence of things like suicide or early teen pregnancy, mental health conditions. These are just some of the impacts facing survivors and intergenerational survivors. And when the institutions that are supposed to be providing you with safety, with education, with skills to move forward are the sources of alienation and oppression, it's hard to move beyond survival towards hope, towards progress, towards things like financial planning or family development. It's a condition of surviving these institutions. And so in Canada, the government has acknowledged 130 residential schools across the country. And Stephen Harper formally apologized for Canada's involvement in the residential school system in 2008. And subsequently, other churches involved, a United Methodist, not subsequently, but as well, United Methodist, Anglican, Presbyterian churches have apologized. The Catholic Church, which I believe ran about 70% of the institutions in Canada, has never formally apologized for their involvement in the residential school system. This year, the Archdiocese in Vancouver and Kamloops have apologized, but the Pope, the Church itself, have not apologized for their involvement in the residential school system. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission estimates that approximately 6,000 to 10,000 children died in residential schools. It's hard to estimate because they're still doing identification, as we've seen this year. The other thing, of course, is that there's a lot of misdocumentation that exists at this during the course of history, because oftentimes kids were labeled as missing or running away. And so I want to take a second to just reflect on this sort of thing, and just talk about the the things that affect Indigenous people beyond residential schools. You know, this isn't to say that the chapter of colonialism is simply defined by residential schools. Similarly, Indigenous communities are faced with the impacts of missing, murdered, and Indigenous women and girls. The 60 scoop, which Bruce mentioned, which pertains to the foster care system, overrepresentation in the prison system, and Indian day schools, which were similar institutions where children would go home. Of course, there's the system of healthcare that existed with Indian hospitals as well. Just to talk about the 60 scoop, from 1951 to 1991, children were taken away from Indigenous communities and placed with non-Indigenous families. And this was an effort to phase out the residential school system, and really picked up in the 1960s. By the 1970s, roughly 1/3 of all children in care were Aboriginal. Approximately 70% of children apprehended were placed into non-Aboriginal homes. And while
Oh, sorry, Wesley.
no worries,
Figure
sorry.
out who that was. Oh, there it is. Got it.
Yeah, and so
Sorry.
just to talk a bit more about this, and this is the residential school history is a terrible chapter, but this isn't to say that this is the end. We see people now working to better themselves, to pursue education, to reclaim traditional languages, to learn about culture, to become entrepreneurs, to become educators, to enroll in education systems. But you still see mistrust in some people, because these were the institutions that provided oppression. If you can't trust authority figures, if you can't trust educational institutions, if you can't trust medical institutions, it's hard to develop those skills, especially when some people may be experiencing survival mode. And we try to encourage at the Survivor Society expressing through trauma, expressing, finding vehicles for people to release, to talk about their experiences, to engage with others. And so we have offices throughout British Columbia. We have a crisis line, which is 24 hours in addition to the national crisis line. We provide emotional support and cultural support. So we have what we call RHSWs, Resolution Health Support Workers, and cultural support providers available. We have some youth programming out of our downtown office in Vancouver. We have some outreach street programming throughout the province as well, but on the downtown east side of Vancouver specifically. And our organization is growing as it currently is standing. But every day we're met with requests for support and for education and for assistance and coaching, and so these are tools that our organization is offering to the community, and we try to encourage moving beyond survival towards hope. That's the goal of our organization. And so we work with survivors, intergenerational survivors, 60 scoop survivors, day school survivors, and we try, and those impacted by missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls, to provide that support. We're not a political organization. We're not a legal advocacy group or anything like that. But we want to encourage that hope, that healing, that self care, and we want to talk with people about these things, and so we try to develop that programming. And so, you know, one thing that I'm regularly asked, especially recently, with news out of especially out of Kamloops, was what can people do to make a difference? What can people do to contribute? And we believe in growth and acceptance and communication, and we believe that we want people to make a difference. And so we encourage people to learn about the impacts of Indian residential schools, to read about the Truth and Reconciliation's 94 recommendations, and there's some specific corporate ones which are really important, which are accessible, to contact their local officials and MPs and talk about how Indigenous people are a priority for them, and how programs that support Indigenous people, be it in an emotional sense, in a cultural sense, or even in a development sense, are available. To take the time to actively listen to people of First Nation, Inuit, and Métis backgrounds, to stand up to stereotype, prejudice, and systemic racism, to have conversations with family and friends, even children, because this is something that everyone can handle and needs to process, that this is a part of Canadian history. We talk about Canadian history as if it's some back in the day thing, but this is still lived. There's survivors here today, and these are people we interact with. Canada does some great things. We've been accepting Syrian refugees. We've been accepting refugees from Afghanistan. We've been making huge strides internationally in terms of AIDS. But this is something domestically we need to pay attention to. We need to make sure that people know about this. And so having those conversations is important. Being respectful towards trauma survivors and elders is a really big thing. Someone has to be ready to talk in order to share their story. And so, we don't want to approach anybody with an oppositional nature. People will be ready to share and are willing to share. And there are people out there who are willing to share from our organization and the community. We encourage people to be patient, empathetic, and receptive. These are distressing times for everyone, especially when these news reports were coming out. People were struggling. Even the strongest of survivors I met were struggling with this information, and it's a totally normal emotional reaction to have. And we encourage people to raise awareness in their community, and online. Even the simplest thing, to talk about it, to discuss it, to talk about the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is something as easy as posting every other day. And so we wear orange, right? We wear these orange T-shirts. We wear these orange shirts, and some people ask me, like, why are we doing this? Why is orange the color? That sort of thing. And it comes back to a story, the experience of a woman named Phyllis Webster Jack. And she is a survivor of residential school. I believe she lives in Prince George now. When she was about to go to residential school, her mother dressed her up in an orange dress, and prepared her and took her to the school. And at these schools, they took away that orange dress, and she never saw it again. Often survivors would be deloused, have their haircuts, be assigned a number, be forced to live in dormitories, which were, full of neglect. And she never saw that orange dress again. And so she started the Orange Shirt Day Society, which is the precursor to the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And it was selected for September 30th. And so that's part of the reason why that day was selected, and why orange has become the color symbol for this holiday. It's kind of weird referring to it as a stat holiday, because it isn't one of commemoration. but we honor the survivors that made it home, and we remember those who didn't. And it's tough talking about this sort of stuff, and you know it, it's something that still pertains to us today. And I want to point out, for instance, that this is still relevant. Um, Within the healthcare system, for instance, the treatment of Joyce Echequan and the neglectful treatment she got, the not only the neglect in the healthcare system, but the racism she experienced from hospital workers while she was in care. Um, then there was the gentleman in Vancouver, the Heisig gentleman who came down to Vancouver, who experienced an incident at the Bank of Montreal, and he was trying to open an account with savings for his granddaughter, and he was subsequently placed in handcuffs, simply on speculation. There are people who are followed around grocery stores or department stores, for that matter, with simple speculation. Uh, Prejudice still exists, and we need to stand out and make sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen as much as we can. We need to give people opportunities to share their voice and to communicate. Um, our organization has been trying to encourage some instances of financial literacy over the years with regards to will preparedness or investment. It's slow goings, and sometimes we don't necessarily have all of that. Everybody's attention for those sort of things, but we see development and interest in things like investment, and it was really interesting to hear Bruce talk about that. There is a National Aboriginal Veterans Day as well. I'm just noticing David Petty's remark. I think it's the 21st of November. And it's, it's interesting with regards to Aboriginal veterans. The equality, the treatment they received during their times of service was not carried forward when they came home, and that's something that historically we have seen. A shift in attitude towards Indigenous people. Even historically, we have the Royal Proclamation. This was the first legal document in the late 1700s that Britain set forward that recognized that Aboriginal title exists and continues to exist unless it is ceded by treaty. And it is the reason why much of Canada is considered, or at least much of British Columbia, for instance, is considered unceded territory, because treaties weren't signed past the Rockies. But we see that this government policy shifted over time from one to of recognizing treaty, of working together and acknowledging trade, shifting towards one of dominance and control, and so we see a move towards aggressive assimilation, disenfranchisement, and we see a chief superintendent being overseeing all of those 600 nations we talked about, and this system continued, and we still have status cards. We still have classifications for who is considered Indigenous under the law. And so this is something that still impacts Canada. This is something that we're still going through. This is something that we need to remember and keep in perspective as we move forward, because more announcements will be made as identifications continue across the country, and Indigenous people make up a significant portion of the Canadian population still, and this is a relevant history. And I am honored to be able to work with survivors. It's a privilege to hear them speak, to share, and I am very grateful for the work I'm able to do. And I want to thank you all for listening to me here today, and for giving me this opportunity. Um, I want to invite some time, before I ramble on and on, for your questions, your input. Uh, I would really like to hear from you. So if anyone has anything they'd like to say, um, you can either raise your hand or just say it out loud, or write it in the chat, and I can read it out at that point. But I really thank you for your attention, and your patience with me here today. It's really appreciated. Oh, and one more thing, of course, I do want to say that, obviously I've talked about some very sensitive things. And so just make sure that you're in a good place here today, and that, if you need support, there's always someone to talk to, either at our organization or in the community. And I, just want to make sure that everybody is able to exercise that self-care and is in a safe place. So thank you again. And I've left my contact information in the chat for those who are interested.
Hashka, thank you, Wesley. It's wonderful to walk through so much that you did. Again, it's such a difficult conversation, but I hope we're all ready for this. David put in a great comment about November 11th, like Remembrance Day, to just be more honest, get the facts, and then build forward. Just a bit of a question around the history since IRSSS initially founded, where the evolution has gone. Do you see progress? Do you see changes? Is there better understanding, supports? How many people are you guys working with today versus initially? Do you have enough resources? Like, I don't know. I'm not trying to push for hope or anything, but
I
how
believe
can
there
we
is
help the
hope.
most? And yeah.
I believe there is hope. You can't do this type of work without believing in hope. I've seen the progress in survivors talking about their experiences. Um, Seeing someone such as that, 70-year-old woman who's never shared their story before, being able to talk about it for the first time, to see that weight lift almost physically off their shoulders. That's not to say everybody has the same healing journey. Everybody's healing journey is unique. But you do see progress, and you do see development. We have programming now. I think a lot of people are paying attention right now, and that's a good thing. It's unfortunate that it took these news announcements for people to pay attention. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was operating full steam until 2015, but it wasn't until recently that more people started paying attention. And we have been very much inundated with calls for support, calls for crisis, calls for donations, calls for expressing support. And so having that 24-hour crisis line was important to us, because we do have the name, the Survivor Society. We primarily operate out of British Columbia, but we have been receiving calls from across the country. I personally have talked to people on the prairies, in the Maritimes, even in the United States, on that crisis line. And this is not to mention that we have offices throughout the province, and provide support. And we have cultural opportunities, like they're developing out of our Saast office a canoe program, which is quite rewarding, and returns to culture, and things like drum making, or smudging or brushing, activities like that are very important for our cultural support providers. The demand is high, and both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people are still hurting right now. And so I think with these announcements, it's a very sensitive time for people, but people are more interested in the issues, and in the potential for things like reconciliation. Obviously, as Bruce said, reconciliation means something different to everyone, and reconciliation is very different than forgiveness. And so we're seeing progress, but what we want to do at the Survivor Society is help people move beyond survival towards wellness, towards self-care, towards hope. And that's what we try to do with an empathetic personal approach.
Well, you have a great supportive community here. To have about 100 of us over under throughout the day just it shows that we have members who care about this and want to be part of this conversation. And although we're just starting this now and learning more, please think of us. You mentioned a bit of financial literacy and awareness. We'd love to share resources or whatever can be there. So in your conversations with survivors, please let them know that there's a large group of people that really are waking up to caring about this and supporting them, however that can be shared. We have one of our speakers coming up a little bit later today. Charlene has asked, Wes, I'd be curious about your most impactful insight, learning, or wisdom you have heard or learned during your time in your current role with IRSSS.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's there's so many things I've learned. I think part of it is one of the big thing is openness and patience. Sometimes in the dominant Canadian culture, we move so fast, and it's even in conversation, jumping over each other, or not taking the time to acknowledge the conditions, the situation that people are in, and sometimes jumping in and wanting to fix things instantly and solve all the solutions. And this can be the impulse that happens in a lot of that dominant society. And even though I like to consider myself a slower, patient person, I find myself sometimes rushing, and I am constantly reminded of the need for patience, for giving people respect and the opportunity to speak, to have that openness, not to project myself onto others, and to give room for those cultural lessons, and to give room for the experiences and the lived experiences. It's if we want to show appreciation for something, we need to take the time. And so, having those acknowledgments, having that respectful dialogue is so important. And it is a collaborative effort, and that's something I definitely have come to appreciate. And so I guess that would be the thing I've taken away the most. Thank you.
Wonderful. Charlene, great question. Wesley, thank you for taking the time to spend it with us here today. And we're hopeful that this is at least an annual conversation, perhaps some quarterly check-ins, some updates. Some people are messaging that they've already made donations. Thank you so much for taking this time and sharing this history. And we hope that continual progress and support can be made as we go through. So would love to check in with you again, stay in touch, and you have some great friends and supporters here through the Advocates community in BC, and then we hope that'll trickle down to the rest of the country as well. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity and your consideration and your support. We really appreciate it. Our organization, our ability is enhanced by the support of the community, and so we really do raise our hands to you and say thank you. I wish I could stay with you longer today. I hope we can do this again in the future. And I want to thank you all again for welcoming me here into your virtual space. And please, if you have any questions or anything like that, just email me. So thank you for your time.